In this video, I'm going to be showing you what it takes to make $100,000 a year with covered calls. If you're new to covered calls or selling options, make sure to check out the videos in the description. Now let's go ahead and jump right into it. So we want to see what it takes to make $100,000 per year with covered calls. There are 52 weeks in a year, but we'll pretend 2 weeks are vacation or non-trading weeks. So we'll use 50 weeks for our calculation. That means you need to make $100,000 divided by 50 weeks, which is $2,000 per week for the whole year. Now let's go ahead and jump into the Thinkorswim platform so we can see what this would take with real covered calls. For this video, I'm going to be looking at TQQQ, which is a triple leveraged ETF and what I trade on a weekly basis. If you want to see the same analysis on a different stock, let me know in the comments. So how much money you need in order to make $2,000 per week with covered calls also depends on how much risk you are willing to take. For this analysis, I'm going to only look at call options expiring the following Friday, and we're going to define risk as the chance of getting assigned on your position and then having to sell your stock. This happens if the stock price ends up closing above the call option at expiration. So again, for this experiment, I'm going to be looking at the following Friday, so these options that expire next Friday, 11 days out. So we're going to go ahead and start with the least risky option. And in this case, in order to define risk, I'm going to be using the delta column. Delta is basically an approximation of the probability that the stock ends up in the money at expiration. So for example, if you have a 0.11 delta, that's an approximation that there's an 11% chance that this option ends up in the money at expiration, which means you would get assigned and then have to sell your shares. So starting with the least risky option, I'm going to be looking at these 0.11 delta call options. And for a covered call, you assume that you own a certain number of shares and then you sell call options against it in order to collect premium. So in this case, if I was going to sell the 11 delta options, I could collect about $18 in premium. And so if my goal is to make $2,000 per week, I could do $2,000 divided by 18, and I would get 111, and I'm going to go ahead and round this up. So 112 is the number of call option contracts I would need to sell in order to make the $2,000 in premium. In order to sell these 112 option contracts, the number of shares that I would need to purchase is equal to 112 option contracts times 100, because each option contract is equal to 100 shares, and then times the current stock price. So the current stock price is $42.98. So in the least risky scenario, I would need $481,000 approximately in order to make $2,000 from selling covered calls. This does not take into account the premium you might make or the additional profit you might make if the stock did close above and from actually owning the shares and the shares getting sold. This is just the profit from collecting premium for selling these options. So although this has a lower chance of getting assigned because it's further away from the current stock price, you need to own a lot more shares in order to sell enough option contracts to make $2,000 per week. Now let's go ahead and look at what we're calling a medium risk option. So now we're going to be selling the call options that are at the 0.22 delta, or approximately have a 22% chance of ending up in the money, or said another way, getting assigned and then having to sell your shares. So again, in this case, if we were selling this, we could collect about $45 per option contract that we sell. So in order to make $2,000, we could do 2,000 divided by $45 per contract. And again, I'm going to go ahead and round this up to 45. So this would take about 45 call options sold at the 0.22 delta in order to make $2,000. And based on this, we can see how many shares we would need to own. So 45 times 100 shares per option contract, then times the actual stock price that it's currently at, $42.98. You would need 4,500 shares, and that would cost you $193,000. So this is less than half of the previous scenario, but again, in this scenario, you do have a higher chance of getting assigned and then having to sell all of your shares. But there is some profit you could make if you did end up getting assigned and selling your shares. Now, in the final scenario, we're going to look at an even closer call option. We're going to go ahead and look directly at this 50 delta option. So there's a 50% chance that this option ends up in the money at expiration, and then you end up getting assigned and having to sell all of your shares. But because this has a much higher chance of getting assigned, it also pays a much higher premium. So in this case, in order to make $2,000 per week, we could get about $151 per contract. So that means we would need 2,000 divided by $151 per contract for about 13.2 contracts, but I'll go ahead and round this up to 14. So you need to sell 14 option contracts at the 0.5 delta in order to make $2,000 approximately. So that means you would need 14 option contracts times 100 again for 100 shares per option contract. So you would need 1,400 shares, which would currently cost you 1,400 times 42.98 or $60,000 in order to own those 1,400 shares and then be able to sell the 14 option contracts at the 0.5 delta. So this requires significantly less than the previous two scenarios, although still a very large amount in order to make those $2,000 per week. All of this data that we're looking at right now is after hours data, and some of this may change when the market opens. Also, this is all assuming you never get assigned and you can just keep selling these covered calls. In a more realistic scenario, you will sell some calls, collect your premium. Eventually, you may get assigned or decide to roll the position. If you do get assigned, you could end up switching to selling puts then, which would be the wheel strategy. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions on what stock you want me to analyze next time, feel free to leave those down below. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.